Well, welcome to the European Journalism 2021 virtual seminar, a digital exploration of key themes and new trends in journalism. This is co-hosted by TFAS International and the Media Project. And this is session 2, Storytelling in Journalism. I'm Melissa Harrison, Senior Programs Manager for the Media Project. For those who may not be aware of the Media Project, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering journalists worldwide to provide a more profound understanding of religion and public life. We host 5 training programs around the world each year and a robust communications network with members worldwide. TMP is also parent organization for Religion Unplugged, an award-winning nonprofit news outlet and online magazine. And we're very happy to be co-hosting this program each year with TFAS, the Fund for American Studies, which offers transformational programs teaching the principles of limited government, free market economics, and honorable leadership to students and young professionals in America and around the world. In addition to the European Journalism Institute, a number of other TFAS programs are geared towards young professionals pursuing careers in the field of journalism and media, and that includes the Joseph Raga Memorial Fellowship for Excellence in Journalism, which provides a 9-month internship with the Wall Street Journal's editorial team, and the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program, which supports a rising generation of serious and enterprising journalists with funding to pursue projects that they otherwise would be unable to research and report. TFAS also offers undergraduates the opportunity to study journalism and communications over 8 weeks through a track of the DC Summer Internships program. So we are very happy to have you here with us today for this important topic of looking at storytelling in journalism. We have a really incredible panel of journalists who are here to tell us about their work as storytellers. Many of them have actually been where you are as alumni of this program, and other ones related to TFAS and the Media Project. So today we're going to have featured speakers. You can read about each of them in your brochure. There are lengthy bios, which will give you really good information about their background. We have David Blevins, who is Senior Ireland Correspondent for Sky News, joining us. We have Sean Gallup, who is the Chief News Photographer for Getty Images in Germany. So Sean, it's wonderful to have you here. We have Stephanie Slade, who is a Novak alum. She is Managing Editor for Reason Magazine, joining us from DC. And Suzanne Kianpour, who is Foreign Affairs and Political Reporter for BBC, joining us from Northern California. So each of these journalists are going to take some time to tell you about their world, to give you some insight into what life is like for them as a reporter, as a journalist, where they're working, and also just to give us a glimpse at what storytelling has been like during this past year with the challenges that we have all faced. They're going to give us some really good insight into specific examples of work that they've done. And while they're speaking, be sure to take notes. We want you to be able to share any questions you may have in the Q&A function that you'll have there on Zoom. So please, don't hesitate to post any questions you may have, and then we'll go back through those for each of these panelists to have them really share more with you. So we'll start first with David Blevins, again, Senior Ireland Correspondent for Sky News. And David, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Fix that. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here today with you. A good evening from Belfast, or good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world joining us today. People say the Irish have a way with words. That's the polite way of asking, do the Irish ever stop talking? And even when we have the right to remain silent, I'm not sure we have the ability. For such a small island, Ireland boasts a large number of authors and journalists and playwrights and poets. Poets like W.B. Yeats, who wrote these very poignant words, all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Those words were inspired by the Irish uprising against British rule in 1916, an event that did change the course of this island's history. And I'm going to borrow them for just a moment, because I think they can be applied to where we find ourselves in journalism right now. All changed utterly. For those of you who don't know me, I've been a journalist for 32 years, 2 years in print, 5 years on radio, and the last 25 years on television at Sky News. Well, where all the focus these days is not on television, of course, but on digital content. I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. The senior means two things: that I lead our team on this island, and secondly, that I've been doing this job for far too long and I'm getting too old. I've reported from 10 different countries on 4 different continents. I've interviewed 2 US presidents, 3 Irish presidents, and every British and Irish Prime Minister in the last 32 years. But my career could be summed up in 2 words, because I've covered the peace process here on this island: war and peace. Now, Xander has a little video to play. I hope this works. It may not operate just as smoothly as it would if you were watching on television, but it'll give you an idea of what has developed through those 30 years, and they're encapsulated here in about 3 minutes, I think. So hopefully the video will work.
These are hardly scenes for the season of peace and goodwill, but not even Christmas could ease the tension surrounding this particular conflict. David Blevins, Sky News in Londonderry. Riot squads came under gun attack at flashpoints right across the province. Youths pelted the security forces with 700 petrol bombs. Without warning, their disputed route to class is rocked by a blast bomb attack. Children, some of them just 4 years old, dive for cover, then flee in fear. Nothing could have prepared Omagh in County Tyrone for 3:10 on August 15th. 29 people, men, women and children, lay dead or dying in the high street. The deadline may have gone, but while they talk around the table, there is hope. One day late, the politicians may be about to decide the destiny of their people.
I'm pleased to announce that the 2 governments and the political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. Suitably dressed in emerald green, the Queen took an historic step into the Republic. His comments were a bit off the wall, comparing the Irish border to the Mexican border, but the President had warm words for the Irish Prime Minister. From the air, you can see how inconspicuous the border is. We crossed it 4 times in 6 miles, here from Northern Ireland into the Republic. This has taken much longer than many people might have anticipated, but right now it appears that Northern Ireland's largest political party is closing in on a deal to prop up Theresa May's minority government. Here in Salt Hill, the police have had to respond several times to reports of people, believe it or not, going swimming in the water behind me, despite the fact that there is a significant swell in it and a very real risk to their lives. There was no battle for the kingdom when the Queen met the Queen and other members of the cast.
I've been thinking I'm going to meet the Queen. It didn't really register, and then there was the Queen.
Ireland rolled out the red carpet, provided the sort of hospitality this country is renowned for. But people here really are questioning the moral authority of the Church in a way that would have been totally unthinkable the last time they had a Pope in their midst.
There you are, just a little snapshot of some of the work that I've been doing over the course of the last 32 years. So you got a royal visit and a papal visit, so it's rather suitable. I think you got a little bit of Game of Thrones in there as well, because of course most of that series was filmed here in Ireland. Let me share just 2 recent examples of the challenges faced by journalists here. Firstly, I want to talk for a moment about Brexit, of course. When the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, it presented a huge problem for this island. Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, would have to leave the EU but the Republic of Ireland, an independent country in its own right, would be remaining in the EU. There would have to be a border somewhere to protect the EU's single market. Now, if they rebuilt the old border on this island, that would unsettle nationalists. It would unsettle Catholics who prefer the idea of a united Ireland. But if they put that border somewhere in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, it would unsettle Unionists, the Protestant community. So for the last 5 years, on and off, we've been reporting that great border debate without there being any visible border on the land or in the sea to film. That's quite a challenge for a television journalist, and it has required real creativity. You see, if you think about that invisible border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, it's just a line on a map. It doesn't actually exist in real terms. So that line on the map, I've walked over it, driven over it, taken a train journey over it, sailed over it, flown over it, put a drone up over it, you name it. We've done it to try and tell the story of the challenge around the Irish border. But the real secret of helping people understand complex political and economic conundrums like Brexit is to find always the human story, the people who are most affected, school children who cross the border to study, nurses who live on one side but work in hospitals on the other, or after much searching, you find the one house that is divided by the border, and we did. One part of that house is in Northern Ireland, outside of the European Union, and the other part of the house is in the Republic of Ireland, inside the European Union. They arguably need a passport to go from having their breakfast to go to their bedroom. So that was one of the challenges, really, finding visual ways to tell a very complex story. And the way we did it was to be creative and to find the human angle, which of course is what I think most journalists prefer to do. So if Brexit presented a mental challenge for us, COVID has presented a physical one, a threat that's radically different to all of the dangers of war zones we've covered over the years. We could talk forever today about PPE and social distancing and desperate attempts to keep a channel on air by limiting the number of people in the news centre to 30 instead of the usual 300 at any one time. But it was Einstein who said, in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. And I think the global pandemic has presented us with an opportunity to review everything we do, to ensure that we emerge into this new world with journalism in better shape than it has ever been before. Those of you who've heard me speak before will know how passionately I feel about investing in this generation of journalists. I'm so disappointed when I hear old hands like me tell younger journalists that they've missed the golden age of the typewriter, the broadsheet, the rolling news channel. I completely disagree with that. If COVID has illustrated anything, it is that the new technology available today creates the potential for this to be the golden era in journalism. We wouldn't even be having this seminar but for that technology. So my thoughts really today are built around the idea that if we can combine the age-old principles of journalism, truth and accuracy and impartiality and balance, with that new technology, then journalism can be, to coin a phrase, great again. That's the battle we fight. It's a battle for the heart and the soul of journalism. Yes, for all sorts of reasons, social media, algorithms, clickbait, all has changed utterly. But a terrible beauty has been born, and I believe it is the opportunity to do this better than we've ever done it before. Back to you, Melissa.
I love that, David. That is so good. I love the golden era of journalism is ahead of us. And it's so true. And it's why we're here. There's so many people joining us who are young, aspiring journalists, and we're so glad you're here. So take this opportunity to really ask people like David, questions and to learn from them. But I agree wholeheartedly with you, David, that hopefully we emerge from this time better, right? Better than we were before. So thank you, David. So now we are going to be able to hear from Sean Gallup, who is with Getty Images. Sean is the chief news photographer in Germany for Getty. And you can read more about him in the brochure there. But Sean, we're so glad to have you with us. So tell us just about how life has been for Getty Images over the past year and just more about the work that you do.
Sure. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Everything
Yes.
good? Great. I work for Getty Images. I assume you've heard of the agency, the world's biggest photo agency. So it has its creative division and its editorial division. Within editorial, there's sports, news, and entertainment. I work for news, and so my job is both to photograph pretty much every single day, covering politics, economics, of course, COVID, human features. But I also work with a network of stringers across the country and in Switzerland and Austria. So altogether, I try to come up with the coverage that we need. So one very important thing to understand, though, is we're not an end publisher. We're not publishing anything ourselves. My job is to try to anticipate what are newspapers, magazines, online media, even television broadcasters, what stories are they covering, what stories are relevant to them, and hence, what are they going to need pictures for? So, of course, within the last year, the biggest story has been COVID. And for me as a photographer, one of the biggest challenges in covering COVID is access into the places where I need to be to show the impact of the pandemic. And a really good example of that is hospitals, right? That's where people are being treated. I'm going to switch over to a little, hold on, let me just get back and I will share my screen to here. And I'll play this. Can you all see that? Great. So we tried, it took us about, I'd say 15 to 20 attempts before any hospital said yes. So last year we got into a couple. The first hospital that I got into was this year, January, in Leipzig, which is in Eastern Germany. So, you know, the pandemic took off here last March, April, a year ago. It went through its waves. So January, this was really at towards the height of the second wave, you know, after Christmas. So I asked them, they said yes, and I was a bit bewildered. Why are you saying yes? But I had no idea when I went down there, and I was a bit afraid to ask, am I going to be there in there for 15 minutes with someone looking over my shoulder and then saying, okay, thanks very much, goodbye. So I arrived and I met with the head of the COVID unit, and she told me some do's and don'ts, and she gave me a mask and a little outfit. And then she left me there. So I was there for about 3 hours. And for me as a photojournalist, that's a tremendous opportunity to just take the time, observe, watch the choreography of how the staff are going in and out of the rooms, dealing with the patients, what are they doing? And of course, it's heartbreaking. There were about 40 patients in this intensive care unit, which had already been expanded, you know, into multiple rooms. It was mostly older people, mostly men, but also some younger people, a couple even in their 30s. And so Leipzig, it's in the state of Saxony, which is the state in Germany that's been hardest hit by the pandemic. It had the highest infection rates, it had the highest death rates. And so with that time, you know, I could really just get a sense of the pace. And for a photojournalist, it's so valuable because so often, you know, you get invited somewhere, there's a press op that lasts 10 seconds, you're in and out. And especially for me, this last picture, I mean, this guy, you know, he's naked on this bed. the body language, it's just complete helplessness and putting his fate in the hands of his caregivers. I don't know if he made it or not. The head of the COVID unit told me that the survivability was about 50% of the patients they had there. So going on to storytelling in journalism, or for me, photojournalism, it's quite rare that a single picture really does it in terms of telling a story. But I want to share quickly just a few that over the years I think have worked. This is from 2018, a NATO summit in Brussels. So then US President Donald Trump, who didn't always see eye to eye with his European counterparts, they were actually watching the flyby of military aircraft, and I guess he was more interested in something else. This was at the height of the refugee crisis in 2015. Chancellor Angela Merkel, who became famous at the time because she actually opened Germany's doors to 1 million refugees. And she had the famous statement, "Wir schaffen das," we can do it. So here she's visiting a refugee shelter, and this is a young man from Iraq who wanted a selfie, and she obliged. And for me, what makes this work is you really see in her body language and her expression a very human quality, which quite rarely comes across from her. She's very German. She likes to get things done. She's very non-fuss, doesn't really care about the media, at least the visual media. But here it really came through. This was towards the beginning of the refugee crisis for Germany. So there had been a huge movement of people up through the Balkans into Hungary and Austria, and eventually that floodgate was opened and they started arriving by train. So this was one of the first pretty big train loads, about 400 people arriving at the main railway station in Munich. And so you can see who this young man is thanking for his arrival. This was a bit later at a shelter. So as these refugees arrived, they were put into shelters all over the country. So this was in the middle of nowhere, east of Berlin, near the border to Poland. This is Mohammed and his daughter Riri, and together his wife Ala. They did the Balkan route, they arrived. And for me, this picture so embodies, the importance and the joy of family. And despite their arduous route and these the Spartan shelter where they were in the uncertainty of their future, they had each other, and that's what was so important. This was during the COVID pandemic last year, during the first wave. There's a town called Gütersloh that has a big meat packing facility, employs thousands of workers, many of them migrant workers. And they had a COVID outbreak. So the region was sealed off, and these mobile units, everybody was staying home. So these mobile units were going out and testing people. And in this situation, the man in the suit who's sitting there, he's from the German Red Cross, and he really took pains to assure this family that was going to be tested, and especially the 3 children, he didn't want them to be scared. And he took his time, he talked to the little boy. And for me, what makes this just zing is the little hand, the hand on his arm, this trusting hand saying, yes, I'm not scared, it's fine, you can stick this thing in my mouth. This was also last year at a senior residence facility here in Berlin, where there had been a COVID outbreak. Several residents died, these elderly residents. And so, family couldn't come visit, it was sealed off, but they have a courtyard. So they invited a singer, this very schmaltzy singer, to sing. And they rolled out the elderly residents, and some of them were watching from the windows, and then the staff, some of them started dancing and coaxing the residents, to have a little fun. A big sort of sideshow of the COVID pandemic has been the anti-lockdown movement, which in Germany has been very vocal. So this was actually last year. This was only a few months ago. There was a big protest in the middle of Berlin that spilled into the Tiergarten Park. And this picture, for me, it really shows this sort of pent-up rage and even potential for violence, this kind of mob aspect to the protesters. Part of what I cover also is climate change and the consequences of climate change. This was from 2 summers ago. I went to Greenland at the end of July when they had a heat wave. So this is well north of the Arctic Circle on an uncharacteristically very warm day. So you can see people were hiking around in t-shirts next to this ice fjord where all the icebergs were melting. And you know, what's the cause of climate change? Well, one cause is that we're burning coal. In Germany, you have these massive open pit coal mines with machinery that's as big as an apartment building. And so there's this one in Eastern Germany, and there's a little vantage point where you can look into the pit. And fortunately, I stayed until it got dark, everything's illuminated, and just these 2 tiny little figures, you know, just workers who for me, you know, they could have been anywhere else, but they put themselves there to really get a sense of the scale of how massive everything is there. So these are just some of the little examples where, you know, it takes a photograph, but it takes that extra little quality to just make it, to tell the story. So that's it for me. Thank you. I will stop sharing because I need to exit. And there we go.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you so much. As a television news reporter, I so appreciate good photography because without it, my job is impossible. The photographers are really behind everything that we do in covering stories. And so I love just the perspective of the photos that you showed. So many great ones. The little boy holding the man's arm. You know, just really being able to put into perspective the people in the mind there, you know, compared their size to that. So really, thank you so much, Sean. I know we're going to have some questions for you in a bit in the Q&A. Let's go to our next panelist now, Stephanie Slade, who is managing editor for Reason magazine. And Stephanie is a Novak alum from 2016. And so Stephanie, tell us about Reason. For those who may not know about Reason, tell us more about the publication and the work that you do there.
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm the managing editor of Reason magazine. We are a political and cultural magazine that covers the news from a libertarian perspective. So we sort of are pretty open about the lens through which we see the world and the lens through which we're going to be telling our stories. We have a website that does you know, daily news coverage, but we also have a print magazine that comes out once a month. And that is what I primarily work on. I'm the print magazine managing editor. I spend almost all my time thinking about that. And working on a monthly print magazine has some particular sort of challenges associated with it. One of which is that we joke that we're forced to live in the future. Anything that I'm ever working on, I mean, any word that you read in Reason magazine was written a minimum, if it's in the magazine and not just on the website, it was written a minimum of 1 month before you're holding it in your hands, and probably a lot more than that, in fact. So compared to the sort of breaking news coverage that some of the other panelists and probably many people watching and attending this conference are used to, this is a very different medium, and it makes it a lot harder to sort of be relevant and not be dated in the things that you're presenting your readers with. So I'm always thinking about, usually about 3 months in the future, what's going to be happening in the world? What are people going to be talking about? What are the issues that are going to be most relevant and salient to people? And what can we contribute to the conversation that will be happening down the line? And is there any story or topic of conversation that we want to try to inject into the conversation? So we're always thinking about those questions when we're planning out an issue of the print magazine. That is challenging in the best of times. During 2020, it was especially almost an impossible thing to do well. We had a sort of strategic plan for how we were going to cover the 2020 presidential election. And in a normal presidential election, you would see many cover stories of our magazine would be sort of, devoted to covering the candidates, the issues that are happening on the campaign trail. We had a plan for that for 2020, but by about April, it became obvious that there was only one story that anyone cared to read about or had any sort of energy to spend on, and that was the pandemic. And so all of our planning and all of our stories that we had commissioned to run the magazine and to go onto the cover of the magazine were completely irrelevant, and would probably have seemed quite inappropriate to put on the cover of our magazine. And so we had to figure out something else, and we had to do it on the fly as the news was sort of, the ground was moving under our feet. News was changing all the time. We're still having to live in the future because, again, at absolute minimum, the story was written a month ago by the time you get the magazine in your inbox. And so we had to try to figure out what to do that. And if you look back at the issues of the magazine that we published, you can go to reason.com/archive, I believe, and see all of the covers of the different issues of the magazine and kind of see how we tried to approach that problem. But it was a real tough one, even more than usual. Because I do magazine journalism, though, there is, and especially because we have the ability to do long form journalism in the magazine format, there is a really cool opportunity that comes with that, which is that we can really think carefully about the stories that we want to tell and put time into telling them. And that is, again, I think it's a thing that is different from when you're trying to put out the news broadcast each day, or to get the front page of your newspaper, to the presses before the deadline. You kind of have to just take the world as it comes and do your best with it. But with a monthly print magazine, you have somewhat of an ability to think and invest time and resources in telling a longer, deeper story, which is a lot of fun. The storytelling aspect is extremely important, especially important when you're expecting somebody to read 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words about something. You need to be able to grip their attention from the beginning. You need to be able to hold it and help them to believe that the thing they're reading is worth their time, that it's interesting enough to keep their attention. And at the end of it, you need to have really clearly conveyed a very sharply sort of constructed thesis for them to walk away with. Because otherwise, 5,000 words later, what did I just read and what am I supposed to have learned from that? So we actually do at Reason talk a lot about writing magazine features, the way you might talk about writing a screenplay for a movie. There's a great book called Save the Cat by Blake Snyder, which is it's a handbook for screenwriters. But we think there's a lot. My colleague Peter Suderman, who's sort of the movie buff on staff, he really pushes us to think in terms of 3-act structures, to think in terms of the different beats that you might find in a movie if you were watching a movie, and to think of how we can take our journalistic storytelling and use those same sort of tools to make the story as interesting as possible. Now, obviously, we're not doing fiction. You can't just make up facts to fit the narrative. But if something is worthy of thousands of words, either on the reader's end or on the writer's end, then it's probably interesting. There's probably an interesting narrative arc there that is going to be that with sort of time and effort you can build out and uncover for the reader in order to sort of keep their attention in that way. But as with movie making, I think a thing that has been very helpful for me to think about is when you sit down to watch a movie, the viewer might not think about this, but the filmmaker knows that camera is taking you exactly where he wants you to be, beat by beat by beat, minute by minute by minute, in order for you to see the story he wants you to see and to get to where he wants you to get at the end. It means that you have to be able to eliminate all the extraneous information that could be distracting from the main idea of the story. And that's it's a really challenging, but a really important part of storytelling in the long form format, which is you become, naturally we all sort of become subject matter experts in the things that we're covering. You know a lot about the things you're writing about, inevitably. You need to learn to not want to tell your reader everything you know, because that's an impossible task. You'll lose them immediately. Instead, you need to be okay with setting aside the vast majority of what you have learned in order to tell them the important things that will help them understand and follow that narrative arc that you've sort of worked out. So So that's an important and a really important part of both, I think, movie making that is directly applicable to journalism. One thing that is less applicable to movie making, but is very important for journalism, is stating your thesis pretty early on in the piece. I think a thing as an editor that I often have to do is to ask the writer to insert a nut graph. So you need a really good lead. You need something that will catch people's attention and make them interested in the subject matter at the beginning. But before you then go from the lead to the meat of the story, you need to take a breath, zoom out, give them a view of where you're going with this very long article that you're asking them to read, and tell them where they're going to end up. So to really preview the thesis statement or the main idea or the purpose, the summary of the piece before, at the end of the lead, before the sort of body of the piece. That's really important. In movie making, you often have a twist ending that really shouldn't happen in journalism. In journalism, you should tell people what they're reading and what they're how they're supposed to, help them know how to interpret what you're telling them as you go along. Otherwise, you're very likely to lose them. So those are some tools and some applications of tools that we have found valuable when it comes, again, to the specific format of long form and especially print magazine storytelling, that are some of which I think are probably just as useful if you're doing web journalism, daily news coverage, and some of which maybe are a little more particularly suited to the timeline that we have available to us as a monthly print magazine, but also that we have to work, to sort of deal with what that means when the world is changing under our feet.
That is so great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I agree. It's so hard as a reporter when you go out and you get all of this information and you just want to include it all and share everything that you've gathered. There's such wisdom in knowing like what to leave out and when to leave things out and to stay focused. And the 3-act structure as well, I think, is really a key for when it comes to writing and putting the stories together. So thank you so much for sharing. We appreciate it, Stephanie. So now we're going to have Suzanne Kianpour, who is foreign affairs and political reporter for BBC. And Suzanne joins us from Northern California. Hello, Suzanne.
Hi, everyone. So I'm normally in Washington, but this week I'm working from Northern California, and it's lovely to be here. I am a TFAS alumni. I was an alumni of the Institute of Political Journalism from 2009, which was such an amazing experience. And I attribute a lot of kind of where my career went to my experiences during that summer. Georgetown. Actually ended up becoming a fellow at Georgetown 10 years later. So it was fun to be back on campus, in more of a teaching capacity. But I agree with, I believe it was David who mentioned the kind of crisis breeds opportunity. I think the pandemic, when it comes to storytelling in particular, made us, particularly those of us in broadcast, made us think differently, made us get creative. So I'm a Washington reporter for our shows that air out of our Washington bureau, BBC World News America, which also airs on PBS. However, I also got into podcasting this year and launched a podcast out of our Washington bureau. And this was in September. So obviously, pandemic is still going on. I was a field reporter. And so normally I'd be out in the field, like doorstepping people and stopping people on the street and, shoving my microphone in their faces or running around the hill. And so instead, I'm literally working from my closet. I mean, my closet was my studio, my radio studio. But I found that in a really interesting way, and we talked about the golden age of journalism. I think that this is the golden age of audio storytelling. We're seeing a resurgence of audio. And audio is so intimate. And I think that the pandemic kind of almost heightened that. And this kind of, sometimes I would be on Skype or Zoom interviewing people for the podcast, but I actually found that when I wasn't on Skype or Zoom, or when we didn't have video on, they would open up more. And I throughout this process, I kind of thought about this Joan Didion quote title, we tell ourselves stories in order to live, because I found that the people that I spoke to were so much more, I don't want to say it was easier to get them to open up, because it never, it's never really easy when you're talking about really difficult things, especially like relatives dying of COVID, for example, or like racial inequality and systemic racism and all of the protests that were going on last year. But I found that during the pandemic, more people were more willing and more vulnerable and more open in telling their deepest kind of thoughts and feelings. And what really kind of touched me in particular was when we were launching this podcast, we wanted to take big issues, and talk about big issues. And our opening episode, our inaugural episode, was the humbling of America, and kind of how the pandemic showed America's vulnerabilities, and the world's superpower is so fractured on so many levels. But we were really adamant about having real people stories, and not just real people stories in the form of hosted content where we're interviewing and there's a lot of the reporter in there. We wanted to really just hear people's raw stories. And so we opened our inaugural episode with an interview that I did with a doctor in Houston, where she was telling her story of being on the front lines. And it was so powerful just hearing the experience, having her recount in like vivid detail her experience. I did the interview and I still got chills when it went out. But a lot of that, I think, is attributed to the fact that there isn't visual. Obviously, I'm primarily a television reporter, so I usually think in terms of pictures, and pictures are so powerful, but there's really something about not seeing the story, like listening to it and feeling into it. So I think that it's a really interesting time in journalism, because there's so many different forms where stories can be told. The topic of digital journalism came up, and the BBC right now is like very much trying to evolve quickly. This like massive organization is trying to kind of like, catch up and keep up with the sort of digital revolution. So we have all kinds of like shows and podcasts and programming and streaming and whatever that just is coming out. So we're thinking about a lot of different ways of how to tell stories. But my kind of the first time where I sort of realized, oh, actually, like this whole digital journalism world is really interesting, was in 2016, when I was in Orlando for the Pulse nightclub shooting. And that was a horrible story. It was a massive story. Every news organization in the world was there, broadcasting live on the big television channels. And my team, the team that I was working on, was in charge of basically finding the real people's stories and telling them digitally. And there were two that really stuck out to me that we did, mainly because I realized like how much of an impact this person telling their story had on them in the course of their own life and their own like processing of their own story. So it's like telling their story helped them in immense ways. And one of them ended up sending a lengthy email and explaining this to us months later. But there was one where there was a survivor of the shooting who was in the club, and she was again recounting in great detail, and it was horrible, about how she survived because she was in the bathroom of the club and a bunch of them were piled on top of each other hiding from the shooter. But she later kind of told us that talking about it helped her process it. And then separately, we wanted to do, there were so many themes around this particular news story, and one of them was religion. And so we found a guy who was a Muslim gay man, and he decided that he wanted to come out to his family to the BBC. And so we did like this digital video where he was an art collector and worked in a museum. And we did this digital video where we kind of like had him basically explain like his art and his work and show us how that influenced kind of who he is as a person. And he went through discussing kind of like what his religion means to him and how he reconciles like the image of his religion and his lifestyle and his sexuality. And basically this story went out on like all of our platforms. So it was on our digital platforms, it was on television, it was on radio, it was on social media, it was absolutely everywhere. And this guy wrote us an email later and said that his family members saw it, that's how they found out. And it actually brought him closer to people that in his family that he, you know, thought that he would lose his relationship with. So I guess that's like a really long way of saying that storytelling is extremely powerful. And whereas we might hear people say that journalism is dying and journalism is dead and it's fractured and it's super partisan, I don't believe that. And also when I see students graduating now and wanting to go into journalism, like they're so lucky that there's so many different places to go and places to create content. I mean, when I was entering the journalism world, there wasn't as many outlets that I could go to, frankly. The options were far more limited than they are now. I mean, I ended up at like the kind of most seemingly traditional organization when it comes to journalism, but actually the opportunities are exciting and endless.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Suzanne. I think we really want to dive into more about that too, as far as finding the human story. I know David talked about that. And I know sometimes that's a hard thing for a young journalist, for any journalist. It's like, how do we find that? Paul Glatter, who is our executive director for the Media Project and executive editor for Religion Unplugged, posted, he actually hosted and moderated yesterday's event, which was about entrepreneurship in journalism, that session. And he asked a question. He said, yesterday we spoke about the decline of trust by some news audiences. I'm curious how David and Sean and Suzanne see that dynamic among their viewers and audiences. Do they see issues with deep fakes, problematic disinformation, video, photo producers rising, etc.? So maybe we want to start with David. What are your thoughts on that, David?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for your question. I know Paul Glatter very well. Obviously, we've done some road trips across the United States talking to students in various colleges, so it's nice to talk to you, Paul. There have always been those who question the veracity of journalism. The difference, of course, these days is that they all have a platform now. It's called social media. And I think what has happened in our experience, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, is that governments have tapped into that populism and have used that in a way to manage the news at times to the extremities of, I know on the other side of the Atlantic, it goes as far as the press being dubbed the enemy of the people. And I think that the danger in that is that we in the media adopt this very defensive position constantly, and we become more at risk of crossing the line between journalism and activism. So this may sound terribly old-fashioned, but I am an old hack. I am an old hand at this business. And I believe we just kind of constantly pull it back to what journalism is all about, and that is the pursuit of truth, to just find the facts, the who, what, where, why, when, report the facts, let the audience come to their own conclusion, but not allow ourselves to be drawn into this constant battle between those who are claiming fake news about everything and the government's wrapped up in that and all of that sort of thing. So for me, it's about just holding on to those age-old principles I talked about in my opening remarks, but certainly that has been our experience on this side of the water as well.
Yeah, I love that, David, the old school journalism. And Sean, how about for you? Have you experienced some of this, especially when it comes to, disinformation video, photos, kind of what are you experiencing at Getty?
Well, one thing that I do hear is, well, who needs news photos from agencies when anybody with a camera and a cell phone is a photo agency. And I would say it comes down to, David, what you said, veracity. Because there's so much manipulation that you don't know if a photo is real or not, or even if the situation, maybe it's a real photo, but the caption is completely misleading and places it in a completely different context than what it really is. So hence, I think the value of photojournalism from trusted sources, where you know images haven't been photoshopped and manipulated or torn out of context, that becomes more vital than ever.
For sure. And Suzanne, how about you with BBC?
Well, we have an entire disinformation unit now, precisely in order to battle this very, very real issue. I actually was a fellow at Atlantic Council and did a big brief report on foreign interference operations using disinformation in particular. And in this one, I focused on Iran, but we obviously saw the real dangers of disinformation just completely skyrocket during the pandemic. So it's something that is a very real threat, frankly, because, like, we're constantly finding like fake BBC accounts and having to have them taken down. We're constantly having our reporters smeared. I mean, it's a really big issue, and just goes to show that it's even more important to, adhere to the kind of, like you say, the veracity.
That's so great. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you, guys. We have an anonymous attendee who's asking the question, does anyone have advice for how to be a good storyteller if you work in a society that is not free, that has limited media freedoms?
So I used to be based in Beirut, and I spent a lot of time in the and particularly Saudi Arabia, pre-MBS and the kind of social reforms that followed, albeit obviously political reforms didn't. And I was actually amazed by, I mean, a lot of the reporting that I ended up doing was kind of underground, but I was amazed at how particularly the Saudi women at the time found ways to get their story out. And, especially with kind of encryption and different apps, you have to be careful which ones to use because some of them purport to be encrypted, but they're actually linked to various intelligence agencies. But there now, with the kind of evolution of technology and the different ways of telling stories, people in closed societies have a much better chance of getting their stories out. I mean, we the BBC often rely on kind of user-generated content in places like Iran, for example, because we can't go in and be there on the ground. Now, that being said, we obviously have to be extremely diligent about verifying as well, because it's just such a complex political situation. There are so many different angles and initiatives and objectives.
And I'm going to jump in as well and just reinforce what Suzanne said earlier about this being the age of audio, because it's going to be an awful lot easier to tell some of those stories where the person is not in vision. Suzanne, I left radio 25 years ago and I still miss it. So I'm a huge fan of audio storytelling. We're doing lots of podcasting on Sky as well. We have a big one coming out in a couple of weeks about the story behind the secret decommissioning of the IRA's arsenal of weapons. So I think a great opportunity to tell some of those stories is through podcasting, because the person who's brave enough to tell their story is not in vision. So I'm reinforcing what you had to say earlier. Let's bring back audio. I'm a big fan.
Well, and also I'm absolutely amazed at just how wide the reach is. So I host, I'm one of the hosts of a podcast we have called The Inquiry, and I hosted an episode about killer robots, and then I had somebody that I hadn't been in touch with for ages who worked at NATO saying, "Oh, I just heard this podcast and can you please do one on NFTs and blockchain? And then, so I did. And then, you know, then other people that I hadn't been in contact with from Asia contacted me saying, oh, I just heard this episode, like, can you do something on this? So it's just, the reach is already vast and it's growing. And as you say, it's a great place for closed societies to get their stories out.
That's great. Some questions for Stephanie. This is from Paul Glatter. He was asking, does Reason consider itself an opinion magazine? How does it aim to make that clear to its readers? And then also, does it see its role in responsible and legitimate critique of mainstream media narratives? How can both Reason and mainstream media outlets like Sky News and BBC help readers to have more trust in media literacy when it comes to news, quality information, and feature storytelling?
I don't necessarily love the word opinion journalism, because, you know, we don't have an op-ed page at Reason, and we frequently get op-ed submissions and have to say, you know what, we don't publish. My goal is anything that we publish at Reason should teach our readers something they didn't know before. There should be something. There should be a teaching, you know, an educational component there. So just having an opinion is basically never going to be enough to sort of meet that bar for us. There are lots of newspapers that do have, you know, the sort of hard news and opinion distinction. And on the opinion page, there are columnists and there are op-eds, and that's great. And I think that I'm a big believer that a sort of healthy media ecosystem should have all those things. But I reject the idea that ideological journalism, because we are an ideological magazine, we're a libertarian magazine, is necessarily unethical or not journalism. Sometimes people will say, well, there's journalism and then there's, you know, opinion, and it's like, or there's journalism and then there's activism. And I think that it can all be done ethically or unethically, and that there are really high, there should be really high standards for the way you produce your journalism, whether or not you are sort of writing from a particular perspective and open about that, or whether you're trying to do what, again, I think is a very important service, which is the sort of very clear, objective, factual news reporting only. Part of what it means to be an ethical journalist in either, you know, regardless, is that you sort of do what you claim to do, that you don't say that you're doing hard news, objective journalism, and then sneak an opinion, that you don't, you know, say that you're a sort of philosophical libertarian magazine, but then actually it seems like you're shilling for the Republican Party. You got to do what you're claiming, be what you're claiming to be, do the thing you're claiming to do ethically and well, and that's kind of how we, I think, approach this. Part of, I think, the lack of trust in media right now is that there is a sense that some people who are claiming to do one thing end up actually doing something else. People don't know who they can trust. But I would be very resistant to the idea that there is not an important role for magazine journalism, which has never sort of fit that sort of traditional newspaper, objective news, you know, hard news versus opinion binary the same way. And magazines just are a different medium, and I think are a valuable one that can tell stories while still sort of being open about having a perspective or trying to persuade readers of something. So if we write about immigration, an immigration issue, we're probably going to want you to come away having a particular view, and maybe having your mind changed about immigration at the end of reading that story, and we're open about that. I do think it is important to be, you know, clear about that. We do a lot of media criticism, because we do think that a lot of outlets are not living up to that sort of standard. One of the aspects of ethical journalism, which is to do what you claim you're doing, and that comes out a lot, and it comes out on both sides of the aisle, sort of, you know, in many ways. Sometimes I think in more pernicious ways, intentional attempts to mislead, and sometimes in just natural seeping in of biases in a newsroom. But we do think that there is a role to play in trying to set the record straight on things and point out inconsistencies and hypocrisy when we see it, without by any means conflating those two things, which is there is a difference between bias seeping in unintentionally in a newsroom where good faith efforts are being made to tell the news as news, versus disinformation or yeah, I mean, just some of the things that we've seen, you know, in the internet era, especially, go far beyond that and deserve to be criticized at a whole different level and a whole different volume, I think.
Yeah, and it was interesting when you were sharing earlier about just the magazine storytelling and format, that you can really take the time to think carefully about the stories that you're covering and how you cover them. I know for us at the Media Project, we launched a couple of years ago, religionunplugged.com, which is our online news magazine. And all of us coming out of the Daily Turn newsrooms, it was really refreshing to be able to stop and say, okay, what stories do we want to cover? And then take the time to really cover them well. So I think there's a lot to that. Along those lines, Stephanie, Michelle Lee was asking, she said, you know, when you were talking in your opening remarks, you were talking about choosing what to include, not to include in a story. She says, I'm curious, you all have covered conflicts and tragedies with so many potential stories in them. How do you choose what stories to focus on and share with your audiences? And do you have any examples of decision-making processes that you've gone through when making the decision of what to include and what not to?
It's hard, but it actually, we have an advantage because we are a libertarian magazine. We often, and this gets back to my belief that in a healthy media ecosystem, you have some of all these different players. We will oftentimes look at a particular story. Maybe a freelancer will pitch us on a story, or maybe somebody on staff will say, I'm trying to decide between which of these angles on a story. And we might say, you know, that is really interesting. I would read that story in The Atlantic, but we don't need to be the ones to write that story because there are lots of other people who will. So let's find the story that has a particular sort of relevance to our mission, to our worldview, to the story that wouldn't otherwise get told in some way. And that's kind of the standard. We just very often will say, well, that's not a reason story. That may be a great story, and I would love to read that story, and I hope somebody writes that story, but it's not a reason story because we're trying to add value. And there are so many amazing, talented journalists out there who aren't libertarians. But we are libertarian journalists who you know, believe that our worldview is the right one, and so we're doing our best to sort of add some diversity to the conversation.
What about for others? Maybe David, how do you go through making the decision of what to include and not to include?
Well, it's very challenging, as you can imagine. Anyone working in television news knows. I often describe the differences of crossing from print journalism into broadcast journalism. In print journalism, it's the art of turning the postage stamp worth of information into a broadsheet. And in broadcast, it's the art of turning a broadsheet of information into a postage stamp. You've got to get it down to about 2.5 minutes, certainly in Sky's terms. I think the two things I would say is you can't afford to be precious. Yes, you want to invest and give it your very best shot, whatever story you're working on, but you can't afford to be precious about it because sometimes it literally does boil down to the personality, the whim of whoever the output editor is on a particular program. But the other thing I would also say is that it's not the issue that it used to be because we now are multi-platform organizations. It used to be devastating if you'd worked really hard on a piece and it hit the cutting room floor and didn't make the program because something else broke at the last minute. Nowadays, that's not so much the case, because if it's a really interesting human story that hasn't made perhaps because there's a big breaking political event, the story will still end up on the website or on the app, or people can go and see that story somewhere. So it's not quite as challenging as it used to be. It's one of the advantages. I know we all feel like we're spinning lots of plates trying to feed all of the different platforms that we're operating for today, but I think it's one of the advantages that it gives us more opportunity to tell more stories.
What about you, Suzanne?
I share the sometimes frustration when you only have 2 minutes 30, and you know what, 2 minutes 30 is really good. That's 2 minutes 30.
I've got a minute 30.
Yeah.
So David, you get a whole minute more over there.
Like a minute 15.
Wow.
The American network is far shorter. When I was at NBC, everything had to just be crammed in. And I mean, and I think there's a danger to that, because then you are really kind of focused on telling the story that you want to tell, and you don't actually get all of the sides that you need to get in. So, I mean, I was always getting into fights about duration with editors at NBC. I still do that at BBC, even though I have like 2 minutes 30. But again, back to why I love audio so much and podcasting so much, is because you have much more time, and so you really can get all of the sides of the story that you need to. And this idea that the audience has a short attention span, that's not always the case. I mean, look at the rise of podcasting, and podcast episodes are half an hour usually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, guys. So we have a question for Sean. Sean, in recent times, use of new gadgets and tools in photography, it's tough to figure out the real and the fake ones. How to check and fix this issue, the changing face of media and using images, plus the guide. How can you train a budding photojournalist?
Well, I would say, forget what you can do on the computer. Concentrate on what's in front of you, and concentrate on visual stories, on visual storytelling. Don't think about, oh, I'll fix it later on the computer, or, oh, I can make it better on the computer. Set that aside. And I mean, at Getty, we have very strict guidelines about what we're allowed to do, and it's very little. So that's where you gain the trust of your readership, or of your customers, of your media clients. So yes, focus on reality and forget the computer.
The same person asked the question, so storytelling through images, what steps or pointers do you follow in choosing the topics or selecting the images for that topic?
Sure. I mean, a lot of, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been doing this for over 20 years. And so there's a lot of gut feeling. I call it a visual vocabulary that you develop over time. And I mean, one great thing, one tremendous freedom I have is that I'm not limited to 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I'm not limited to 5,000 words. I can send out as many pictures as I want. Whether anybody uses them or not is another question. But basically any event that I cover, I'm always thinking in terms of a picture gallery. So there are always the establishing shots, there are the tight shots. Pretty much everything that gets published is horizontal because we live in a digital world, but I always think of magazines and they need verticals. So I always try to toss in a few verticals. And always think about just the human aspect of what you're covering, about looking for for body language and people's eyes. People's eyes are incredibly expressive. So just watch it. So as you do this over time, you almost instantaneously dismiss one thing and adhere to another. You're at a protest and there are a gazillion people, but you just see one little scene where you lock on and you follow it. And I mean, another thing is, for a photographer, we never know what's going to happen in 2 seconds or in a minute. So I can be shooting something and I think, yeah, that's working, okay. But then that might develop into something that's so much better. And then everything I just shot for the last 5 minutes, I don't need, but I don't know that. So you're always working a situation and not influencing the situation, but working it just to see what happens. And so often it's just a matter of, instead of shooting here, just move over a little bit. It's all about the clarity of visual storytelling. You're essentially a painter filling a canvas, but you don't control that. The way you can control it is by moving and by waiting for the right moment. So that's a lot. That's kind of a cascade, I know, but it's the foundation of good photojournalism.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's such an art to it. Thank you so much. Sean, we have another question. Michelle was saying that yesterday they talked about the fact that many journalists live in urban, perhaps wealthier areas. So some citizens may not trust journalists or feel like their stories aren't being told. How do you, your organizations, make sure that it's not just stories of the elite that are told? So anyone who would like to share about that, how do you really make sure you're getting a wide range of people that you're telling your stories about?
In the UK, they have just launched a new station called GB News, which could roughly be described, I suppose, as an attempt to establish Fox News in the UK. It's not owned by Fox or anything like that, but it's the same kind of idea. And one of their big selling points is they keep telling everyone that they have correspondents in every single corner of Great Britain. And that's terribly frustrating, I have to say, for Sky News and for the BBC, because we've always had correspondents in every single corner of the United Kingdom and Ireland. So in some ways, it's a misconception that we are not interested in news from outside of the metropolitan areas. But I think also I would have to be fair and say there has been a danger politically of us focusing on those metropolitan areas. I think we would have to concede that if the media had spent a little bit more time outside of Westminster in the run-up to the referendum on the UK's exit from the European Union, we would have seen the Brexit result coming. It would not have taken us by surprise, because the feeling outside of Westminster and Greater London was very different what was happening there. I dare to suggest, one of my American colleagues, I'm sure, will tell me if I'm wrong, but it was probably similar around the election of Donald Trump. If the political media had spent a little bit more time outside of Washington, they may have seen that election coming and not been as surprised by it. So I think it is important that we do hear from voices outside the metropolitan areas. We're working on it. I think maybe we can do better on it, particularly around political stories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree. I was embedded with Hillary Clinton in 2016. So yes, we then later spent a lot of time going over to the quote unquote flyover states afterwards to get to know the people who ended up voting for Donald Trump in places like Nebraska, because those weren't the places that most of the US media have really gone to. Although, to be fair, the BBC did do a fair amount of feature reporting, but we were kind of really the only one. I wouldn't say we were the only ones. I mean, Sky did it as well, or ITN as well. It's like American news organizations in 2016 didn't do the kind of reporting in the areas where Donald Trump won overwhelmingly. So it is an issue, but I think that especially with kind of like more of a emphasis on making sure that newsrooms are more diverse, not just like gender and racial, but also socioeconomically. I know that the Grenfell Tower, which was a very British story where that, that tragic story, there was, I guess, feedback that some of the coverage maybe was slightly tone deaf because some of the journalists didn't really know what it was like to live in a place like that. So I think socioeconomic differences is something that isn't something we really often think about when it comes to, being a reporter and then going and talking to people who just grew up differently than you and lived differently than you.
And I know with
thought, which is,
oh, go ahead, Stephanie. Yes.
I just was going to offer a different sort of, because unfortunately a small magazine like Reason, relatively small, like we don't have people in every corner, sadly. I wish we could afford to have people everywhere. There is the sort of thing that we have evolved to do instead is to have our writers become subject matter experts, write compassionately about the things, the people who are touched by the stories that they're telling, in such a way that sources will want to seek you out. So I'm thinking of our criminal justice reporting. We've just become a leader over the years. Libertarians have always been big, beating the drum on the need for criminal justice reform and the injustices in our criminal justice system. And so telling those stories, when somebody has a story and they say, I'm trying to decide who to go to, either a whistleblower in the government. We recently had a whistleblower approach us because they said, you've done good reporting in this area and I want you to be the ones to tell the story. Or when somebody has been affected, again, with criminal justice, with immigration, we do a lot of immigration reporting. The drug war, we've been big opponents of the drug war over the years. So by having writers who are honest and who are knowledgeable and who are ethical and who are in a beat and very clearly in the beat and become known for writing about that issue, you have the ability to, if you're lucky, have sources start to seek you out as well and tell you about stories that you might never have been able to find otherwise, because you just can't be everywhere when you're a small organization.
That's great, Stephanie. And then also, I know for, just for us visually when we're telling stories is to make sure that we show people from, lots of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different neighborhoods, communities. So Sean, for you, how does this work for you, really seeking out people to make sure that the stories you tell, whether maybe COVID or others, that you show people from different backgrounds and different demographics? Is that something that you have to think of when you're shooting?
Yes. I mean, especially a country like Germany, most people think of Germany as a very homogeneous, when in fact, I mean, especially in the big cities, it's not. And you really have generations of people who have been born here who are German, but they don't look like your blonde, white German. And so that is something, it's certainly something that I keep in mind. I mean, of course, it depends on the story, but especially for me as a non-German, as an American who's come here, I mean, I think my eyes are a bit more open to that. And I get frustrated a bit when, let's say there's a politician or whoever who is Black, let's say, but people are surprised that, friends of mine or whoever, people are surprised, oh yeah, but no, he's German. He really is German. So the short answer is absolutely yes.
Great, thank you so much. Julia Brown has a question. How do you decide which medium, so long form, short, video, audio, photo essay, is right for a story? And do you ever create multiple pieces of content for a single topic, like have a long form to accompany a podcast? She's had employers who want one of everything for each story. How are you guys finding this multimedia time to be? Are you expected? And I know, Stephanie, I spent some time yesterday on Reason's site, and I was really impressed with the multimedia aspect that you guys bring to your storytelling. So is that something that you ask for reporters and people are covering? Does it just depend on the story?
So we were an early adopter of, we sort of launched a video department pretty early, before a lot of people, at least in our space. Obviously TV was always doing this, but magazines often didn't have video components. We built out a department that would focus on that years ago, and have now added podcasting to that as well. The one sort of problem is that there is a pretty sharp distinction between what we call our words people and our audio visual people. So we have producers who do visual storytelling or podcasting, and we have writers and editors like me who really have none of those skills. And I know in the 21st century, every journalist is supposed to be a sort of triple threat, and probably everybody should be building those skills. But we have kind of a distinction at Reason, so that we will sometimes have a writer writing a story at the same time that a producer is producing a video on a similar topic. And one of the things that we have to do is make sure that they're talking to each other, and that there is a sort of, there's often going to be duplication of work, I think, but at least that there's not any kind of contradictions or anything there. And that's kind of the way we have approached, again, as a small institution, that we have these two different departments doing these different kinds of work. But the thing that unites us is, again, our worldview. On the word side, there's always going to be a conversation. Is this right for a 400-word web piece, a 1,200-word web piece, or a 3,000-word print piece? That's always going to be a conversation. And sometimes we do have a shorter version of a piece and a longer version of a piece or something. But I don't know, the way to think about how you make those decisions is almost hard to put into. It's hard to articulate that sometimes something is urgent and deserves to go out, and so we're going to run it on the web, and it's not going to make it into the print magazine, and that has to be okay because of the constraints of print.
Yeah, that's great. What about you, Suzanne? Do you have to do multiple forms? I know you've done more audio, obviously, with the podcasting now, but when you're covering one story, are you doing multiple areas, multimedia, to cover it?
I mean, I actually have, podcasting for me is new. I've only started it last fall. Up until then, I, was a reporter who was in the field and like 52 countries with a ton of outlets that we had to feed. So I was used to feeding like, 3 different radio programs and doing live shots for both television channels, both the network, UK network, and the international channel. I mean, so, and then obviously you have to file for text pieces for online. So the multimedia thing is not foreign to me, because people have their preferences. Some people prefer to listen to the radio, some people prefer to watch television, some people prefer to get all of their news from Instagram. So we have to be everywhere because we want to get the information to as many different demographics and parts of the audience age groups as possible. So obviously I think everyone probably has their preference, but at least at the BBC we still have to do it all, and I don't see that changing.
Related to that, we have found that our YouTube audience, for example, is totally different from our magazine readership.
Right.
So you are reaching different people by telling these stories in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
my students don't have televisions for the most part, so they're not getting their news from TV, for example.
Yeah, but I would say for me, I'm shooting a lot of video actually. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it was only occasionally, but now it's pretty much every other assignment. And that stems from 2 factors. One is that there's more demand for video. So, every newspaper that has a website is also using video on its website. So you've got exploding demand for video, but also it's become, thanks to technology, it's become so much easier without having to carry a lot of equipment. With the same camera that I'm shooting the photographs with, in a second, I can switch over to video and have very high quality, stabilized video, just handheld. It depends on the situation. If it's something that's very fast, because my priority is always going to be still photos. But if I'm in a situation where I see something repeating, or now that I've been doing this a bit longer, I'm already starting to discern, okay, this situation, it's not going to do much for photo, but for video, it's great. So I'm going to shoot this until it gets here. And then I know I'm going to switch over to photo, because that's when it starts becoming interesting for photo. So yes, that's had a tremendous impact on how I approach my coverage and my workflow.
One of our things at the Media Project, we really, and hence the name Religion Unplugged, we always look for the way to tell the religion story in a story, and really that kind of have that angle. Sometimes it's really obvious, other times it's very subtle, but that's really our audience. So any tips for, how to recognize religion stories, or a story that may make a really good piece? I know, David, you've talked about this some with some of the talks that you've given for the Media Project. Any tips that you might have?
Yeah, actually, the last question and this question marry together for me. I'll just remind you all of how old I am by saying when I started reporting for Sky News, I had 5 people minimum on every assignment. Myself, the camera operator, the sound operator, the satellite engineer, and the producer, and we had 2 jobs: to deal with the live spots and to news gather for the package coming up, the VT, later in the day. Now on most stories we have 2 people rather than 5, myself and the camera operator, who's doing all of the jobs that everyone was doing previously. And instead of having 2 things to worry about, the live spots and the news gathering, we're dealing with about 5 things. So it's completely turned around, because as Suzanne has explained, not only are we doing live spots and the VT later, but we're writing perhaps the news lead for online. 9 times out of 10, they want some analysis from you. They want some guidance for the digital video that's being cut back in base. And the reason I say the 2 things marry together, because you can have a great team back in base. I know that the BBC will have that. We certainly have a terrific digital team, and it has completely expanded again. When I joined Sky News, the television output was the backbone of the newsroom, and everything else fed off that. Now the digital content is the backbone of the newsroom, and everything else feeds off that. But when all of that is being done back in base, or a huge amount of it around digital content, you still get the phone call because it's a specialist area. Ireland, it can be really complicated if you don't understand the difference between a Protestant and a Catholic, between a unionist and a nationalist. I'm still going to get the phone call from some of those journalists back in base. So I would really, and this is a big shout out now, Melissa, for the media project, I really encourage religious as well as political literacy among journalists coming up, because you will have less need to rely on your specialist in the field. If you are a journalist and you're parachuted into the Middle East, for example, and you don't know the different types of Muslim there are out there, you're not going to do a very good job. If you're parachuted into Ireland and you don't know the difference between the different types of Christian, Protestant, and Catholic, you're not going to do a very good job. So it's not just about political literacy, it's about religious literacy as well. And I think personally, Melissa, there's a religious angle almost to nearly every story you do.
That's great. Thank you, David. Anyone else? Any thoughts on finding the religious angle?
So Reason is a very secular magazine, but I am a religious person of faith. I'm Catholic. And I was, I think, the only one when I was first hired at Reason who sort of was a person of faith of any kind. And so immediately they were like, oh, you should write about these religious stories. And they sort of pushed me in that direction. And it has become now, when I can find the time to write, usually I'm writing at the intersection of religion and politics. I think that there is something to be said for religious diversity, as well as all the other kinds of diversity that matter in a newsroom. And having people, I mean, my colleagues will just sometimes come to me and ask me questions that they about Catholicism or Christianity in general, or religion more broadly, although I cease to be any kind of an expert once you get very far away from my own faith. But that there often is, I think it's a fair critique to say that many mainstream media newsrooms are lacking in diversity in this way, and that it does harm their ability to tell stories in a really fair and accurate way. Again, I don't think that this is an example of any kind of intentional or malicious, deplatforming or anything, but I think that it is a problem. I mean, it is a reality and a real phenomenon, and a thing that affects the output of various institutions, even when they're trying their best. There probably are not very many evangelical Christians in a lot of mainstream media newsrooms, and there probably are not very many people who are more than cultural Catholics in a lot of mainstream media newsrooms, and these things do matter, and it is worth thinking about whether, I think our sort of media landscape can do better in that way.
That's great, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Sean, any thoughts on?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, in terms of my reporting, I don't know if you all are aware, but there's a tremendous grassroots movement within the Catholic Church in Germany at the moment, really pushing for reform on several fronts. There were a number of Catholic clergy all across Germany that one weekend were blessing homosexual couples. There's this a movement that's called Maria 2.0 that's really pushing for inclusion of women clergy, or allowing women clergy within the Catholic Church. And as far as I can tell, it's one of the most concentrated efforts anywhere in the world that I can tell. And this is really, it's been evolving for a while, but in terms of my coverage, just in terms of figuring out, okay, what is the structure of the Catholic Church in Germany? What do I need to be paying attention to? The bishops' conference, and who's the important bishop there, and what about this archdiocese? I'm paying attention now, and it's fascinating. It's historic.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I know this is actually a good segue, because tomorrow the session's going to be on reporting on religion, which is really great to really dive into this even deeper. But thank you guys so much for your time. What a great session. What incredible journalists and storytellers you all are. And I think it's going to be really fun for us all to follow you. Everyone, you can find out more details about each of these speakers by going onto the brochure. Follow them on social media, follow their digital stories, send story ideas to them as you may have them. But we just so appreciate your time, David and Stephanie, Sean, Suzanne. Thank you so much.